Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this podcast Theory by Afikra and CommunityJameel that will be looking at pastoralism and food security in Eastern Africa and the MENA region. So before starting the conversation, I'd like to introduce you to each other. Dr. Guyo Roba, you're the head of the Jameel Observatory for Food Security Early Action that is based in Kenya, more specifically at Iluri campus. The Jameel Observatory leverages data and traditional knowledge to strengthen early warning systems so that communities in Eastern Africa can prepare and overcome climate-related food security challenges. Professor Rami, you're a professor at the American University of Beirut, an expert on food security in the MENA region, and also a distinguished member of the advisory committee that's currently building the Jameel Index for food trade and vulnerability. In terms of challenges, do we see the same weather shocks in Eastern Africa and the Arab region? And if not, how do they differ? And also, how do they differ in terms of impact on food systems in both regions?
By definition, they all exist in low input system. Basically, it means that quite a number of pastoral groups, whether in North Africa, in Central Africa, in West Africa, East Africa, they all somehow are found in dryland area. And because of that, these are common shocks that connects both, which basically in our case largely is the drought.
I can see the parallels in the region. However, one needs to factor in the dynamics of the changes, the transformations of pastoralism in the region in order to understand what makes pastoralism less resilient and more exposed to climate shocks than ever before. That's an important, because our region is a region in which droughts are intermittent. What climate change is going to do, is going to make those droughts more frequent and more pronounced. Pastoralism, mobility in pastoralism is essentially one way in which people used to address those droughts. Now, this delicate balance has been destroyed over the years by many changes. So the first big change was the creation of the nation state. That's, the creation of boundaries which have compressed the areas of movement. And movement is absolutely, critical to people who practice mobile pastoralism, especially in low rainfall areas. The second issue is the intensification of pastoralism connected to two things. One, the change in diets and the increased demand on meat and meat products. And the second one is the availability of capital that needs to expand, and it needed to expand somewhere.
Yeah, I think very true. I think in our region, increasingly, because I come from pastoral community in the northern Kenya, as you said, I think historically the drought has been a huge part of pastoral systems, and mobility is one way of escaping any episodic, whether it's disease, whether it's a drought, and etc. And this is the common thread that run between pastoral systems. But I think increasingly over the last couple of years, because on average, if you look at a typical practical case of a pastoral household, it takes almost an average of 5 years to bounce back from very intensive drought to where you were before. As you said, it grows and then it crashes. It grows and crashes. So for you to bounce back, it takes you an average of like 5 years. So when you have back-to-back drought that don't give you that luxury, then a number of households goes into destitution. In our region, I think fundamentally, I think there's no question about whether pastoralism is an important part of our food system. It is, because if you can just come to Kenya as an example, I think 85 to 90% of the meat consumed within urban center and outside urban centers contributed by pastoral systems. And just taking a casual look at the central markets here in Nairobi will tell you how many trucks make its way from 600 kilometer, 700 kilometer far-flung areas into the center.
Absolutely, 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 Guyo. Thank you very much for making that point about the integration of pastoralism, the historical integration of pastoralism in the ecosystem of the steppe areas of the Badia. The way, you know, over more than 10,000 years, pastoralists, mobile pastoralists, have shaped the ecosystem of these regions. There is no food system that is standing of its own right and that is self-serving. Food systems serve humans. A food system can be sustainable, equitable, resilient. This is how we want it to be. Okay? The disappearance of pastoralism in its traditional format, you know, the equilibrium, the integration of pastoralists within the balance of the ecosystem, this disappearance means that an entire region is going to be removed from the production of food, from its usefulness. The Arab region is 90% deserts or steppe, as you just said for your own region. Do you know what that means? That means that if you abandon pastoralism, you're actually saying, my region, the only thing that counts in my region is 10% of my region. You know, the rest, the people who live in it, they can either move to the city where they become urban poor, or they can just disappear. And I will replace them with something else. Okay? And in order to replace what they provide, as Guyo was saying, you know, they provide 80% or 90% of the meat and the dairy that is consumed in the city, specifically, what he didn't say, by the poorer people. Specifically by the poorer people. So the only source of animal protein for the poorer classes is very often coming from pastoralists.
Thank you, Professor. Moving to the topic of early warning systems, can you please elaborate, Guyo, as head of the Jameel Observatory, on the steps taken or about to be taken by the Jameel Observatory in order to strengthen those early warning systems?
At the Jameel Observatory, we essentially what we are running is an action research, which basically means it's a research that is aimed at solving, you know, existing world problem in our region, which is dryland area. And I think research and evidence is really a very important missing plank in all our response architecture of drought. And I can contextualize why it is. For the last 50 years, our response strategy in the region is very reactive and is very much centered on humanitarian support. Every time, I think, for those who are outside the region, you always see appeal for Somalia, appeal for Horn of Africa at the height of the emergency. And these appeals are very expensive appeals, largely unmet. And because of that, people who are waiting for humanitarian support really, you know, lose their livestock asset or even, you know, their life. Like in 2011, I think a quarter of a million population in Somalia died from 2011 drought. So research is essential because we need to improve our early warning, delivery of early warning, and what we call this trigger. Basically, how do you get indicators that can help us to unleash support along the drought cycle? Because drought is not a static thing. It takes like 6 months between the normal time to point when it reaches an emergency and then goes into recovery phase. So the Jameel Observatory research is centered around building this evidence around essentially 5 things. One is the data for effective early warning. How do we improve the data question that I just raised around last mile connectivity, packaging, and delivery? The second is how do you coordinate? Because I think drought, being a complex issue, has so many actors, especially when it comes to an emergency point. And largely in our region, they are not all coordinated by central agency. And that coordination question becomes an important question that every government wants us to support them in. Financing early action is another one. We have early warning, which is not by much by early action, which is not much by structured financing. We don't have multi-year layered structured financing. So the third question that we're working on is on this financing question, and how do you make sure that we translate early warning, improve the system and mechanism of delivery to make sure that financing is there to help, responding to drought. Of course, the third is this question around building data, socioeconomic data, bringing a volume of socioeconomic data from, ILRI, Earth observation capability from Edinburgh University and others to build trust in data. The most effective response happen at the local level by the community of the local or the local agencies. But then those people are not well resourced or financed to respond in time. And that compounds the problem. So our last question, which is the fifth question, is how do you actually connect this dot and bring the local level effectiveness and urgency to respond to this drought? So, and this now entirely explain the importance of evidence around these 5 questions. And lastly, I think as much as the early warning system have really improved, we are not matching with the capacity of those who are responding.
I really don't have much to say about early warning system. Firstly, and most importantly, because Guyo has really covered it very thoroughly. However, in our region, there is another issue that's extremely important, that is for which climate change is a threat multiplier. You probably know that the region here, especially the more desertic part of the region, is an arena for wars. You just need to look at Iraq, at Syria, at Palestine today to see the interaction that exists between conflict, food, and pastoralism. The Sinai, for example, is an area that was used traditionally by Bedouins, so the dwellers of the Badia, and the operations over the past 50 years, in addition to what we're seeing today, is something that is destroying the life of pastoralists way more than any other human-made threat can do.
What is the role of education and capacity building when it comes to protecting a pastoralist and strengthening early warning systems?
I think nobody's capturing drought issue as an important part of the disaster. We deal with a number of other disasters, but then each universities are interested in how do you bring this conversation around anticipatory action, around early warning into their curriculum, university curriculum, and that is a very good opportunity for us, because if we work on ready to go curriculum, then the change through the university become essential. And lastly, I think that we're looking at is possibility of having the next change agents within the region by bringing, junior fellows to the observatory who rotate within the system through our partners in policy, through our partners in local level research and others, and run maybe for a period of 1 year structured fellowship that help bring people from the government who are the next leaders in the next 10, 15 years at the forefront of responding to drought. And I think combination of all that means a better prepared capacity to understand, to frame, and to resource drought responses.
For a long time ago, our knowledge of pastoralism has gone away, slowly eroding, remaining in the minds and the indigenous knowledge of a few people who live in squalor and misery and on the margins of the region. However, this was not always the case. As an Arab speaking, Nader would probably know that there used to be nothing called agriculture, az-zira'a. We use 2 terms. We call al-filaha, which is plowing the land, and ar-ra'i, which is pastoralism. These are the 2 branches of food production. The branch called agriculture, az-zira'a, only refers, and look at how much it is embedded in our psyche and in the way we teach. Zara'a yazra'u means to seed, to put a seed or a tree. So the whole system neglects completely at the intellectual level the entire pastoralist system and the animal production system and reduces it to something that can be folded under the general rubric of plowing, of cropping the land and planting the land. And I think this is a very, important signal that we need to give to the generations that come. That settled farming is an important part, but pastoralism that has disappeared from our curricula is an equally important part.
Guyo, do you have any recommendations for policymakers at COP from your side, particularly more specifically on food system transformation and food security?
But I think since early warning investment have been increasing over the years, I think there's a need to call for more push on investment in capacity for people who are using early warning, so that the two will going to match each other, because currently one is few steps behind the other. You have your early warning, you have no capacity for early action, you have no financing for early action. And I think these two areas should form a very substantive, request within COP for further investment, especially in responding to shocks of the magnitude that we have dealt with in the last, 2 years in the Horn of Africa.
Thank you, Guyo. Professor, any recommendations from your side or any final thoughts?
Well, as a wrap up, I would say that this focus on pastoralism is extremely welcome and very timely, but that we will constantly need to separate the mobile pastoralism carried out by people whose livelihood is fragile, with pastoralism, or a new model of pastoralism that involves heavy equipment and large-scale investment that is based on the import of feed and hand feeding, and that overlaps with settled farming in ways that creates conflicts, essentially due to the capitalization of both parts. I am calling on policy makers and policy advisors to educate themselves and the policymaker, but also because in a lot of situations, there are conflicting interests between the people who are, or what should be conflicting interests between decision makers and investors. Decision makers should be working for the benefit of everyone, but very often you find that their comprehension, not to say their individual benefit, comes first before the marginalized people who are never seen.
I'd like to thank you both. That was a very interesting discussion.